So this is English 330-5, Part 2. Just a quick review of dates now that I have my visual slides available to me. The date of composition that scholars generally assign to mankind is circa 1464. But the manuscript, the macro manuscript, which contains mankind, it can be dated roughly to 1440 or 14 through 1475. Though, of course, since the date of the manuscript containing mankind cannot predate its composition, remember that manuscripts can be composed in pieces, and since scholars also think that the Castle of Perseverance was composed earlier, we likely have a wide range of possibilities for dates to assign to the manuscript. But time has come to drop a little bit of theory into our discussions. I'm going to preface this by saying that I am no Foucauldian, I am a medievalist, but I am going to share with you and spend a little time on a quotation from Michel Foucault's History of Sexuality. Foucault is here talking in the 1970s about how psyched everyone in the 60s and 70s was to have just freed themselves, sexual revolution, from the repressive sexual models of the Victorian era, throwing off those Victorian sexual models. Now it's the 60s and 70s, we're free. But, he writes, have we not liberated ourselves from those 2 long centuries, that is the 19th and most of the 20th century since the Victorian times, in which the history of sexuality must be seen, first of all, as the chronicle of an increasing repression? Only to a slight extent, we are told, right? So here he is describing what is taken as obvious in the 60s and 70s. In the mainstream 60s and 70s Western bourgeois discourse, everybody is saying, oh yes, we have finally thrown off the sexual repression of the past, but we have only just begun, and there's so much further we can go, only to a slight extent. Okay, but Foucault begs to differ. He writes, the affirmation of a sexuality that has never been more rigorously subjugated than during the age of the hypocritical, bustling, and responsible bourgeoisie, pausing there. Now he's talking about the 1970s here in his own present day, and he's calling out mainstream discourse about sexuality, calling it distinctly middle class and calling it kind of basic, bourgeois, right? Saying it's a middle class basic revolution that is itself an instrument of subjugation. Here he implies, and this comes out in his other writing, that shedding relentless light on something, to surveil it, for instance, shedding relentless light on something, as the 70s did with sexuality, exposing it, naming it and labeling it, and putting it in the law books and the studies and the political tracts and on flags and on product labels and on camera. That's not exactly the same thing as freeing it, necessarily. And it can often do the opposite in relation to everyday sexual practice. Foucault writes, the affirmation of a sexuality that has never been more rigorously subjugated than now, during the age of the hypocritical, bustling, and responsible bourgeoisie, is coupled with the grandiloquence of a discourse purporting to reveal the truth about sex, to modify its economy within reality, to subvert the law that governs it and change its future. He continues, we must not be surprised, then, if the effects of liberation, vis-a-vis this repressive power, are so slow to manifest themselves. The effort to speak freely about sex and accept its reality is so alien to a historical sequence that has gone unbroken for 1,000 years now, and so inimical to the intrinsic mechanisms of power, that it is bound to make little headway for a long time before succeeding in its mission. You get it? He's saying, in other words, that this hypocritical, bustling, and responsible 1970s sexual revolution relies on its revolutionary feel on the assumption that the past was significantly more repressed sexually than the present, so that anyone who might be impatient for the effects of sexual liberation to actually free their own sexuality should remind themselves that how much better off they are now than they were before. Should remind themselves how much better off they are now than they were before. And so, if you're still feeling repressed during the sexual revolution, then you should just shut up and be grateful that you're lucky enough to be born now. Because now is the most sexually free time in history. You should have seen what it would have been like for you before. That persistent, modern, doxic, taken-for-granted assumption The assumption that past societies must always have been more repressive to human bodies and their desires than later societies were or are, is called by Foucault the repressive hypothesis. Foucault wanted us to question that repressive hypothesis, to take that repressive hypothesis out of the doxa we all assume without questioning, to stop assuming automatically that past societies must always have been more repressive to human bodies and their desires than later ones were or are. He continues, one can raise three serious doubts concerning what I shall term the repressive hypothesis. First doubt, is sexual repression truly an established historical fact? Second doubt, do the workings of power, and in particular those mechanisms that are brought into play in societies such as ours, really belong primarily to the category of repression? Are prohibition, censorship, and denial truly the forms through which power is exercised in a general way? A third and final doubt, did the critical discourse that addresses itself to repression, i.e. the sexual revolution happening right now, come to act as a roadblock to a power mechanism that had operated unchallenged up to that point? Or is it not in fact part of the same historical network as the thing it denounces and doubtless misrepresents by calling it repression? Was there really a historical rupture between the age of repression and the critical analysis of repression?
So yes, we are currently on a temporary detour from matters immediately relevant to mankind, but it strikes me as a good time to take that detour because Foucault's ideas are equally applicable into repressions that aren't expressly sexual, and to periods even earlier than the Victorian, i.e. the medieval. Many of your comments that you sent in on the first day about why your lives are better today than in the 1420s were in relation to the rights of women, or that is the freedoms of women. Remember, what is the difference between rights and freedoms? Before I return to mankind, I will get there in time. I'd like to continue to lay down some theoretical frameworks for our class by dwelling on the question of women's status in society, viewed via the repressive hypothesis. So, stay with me here. Let's take a brief look at the work of feminist historian Judith Bennett, who's writing for S.H. Rigby's Companion to Britain in the Later Middle Ages. It's a very reader-friendly thing, Judith Bennett here. For now, I recommend that if you are one of the people who cited women's freedoms or rights as a primary difference between then and now, I recommend you do seek this out and read more of Bennett's entry in this book if you can. You can find it, as I found it here, at Google Books. Some of it is blocked out, but this section is for free, and most of it is readable. So, for now, I'll summarize the part that we have here under her change over time. According to Bennett, the relative status of women, following my cursor, is, quote, a much debated topic here, with some arguing that women's status has improved over time, others arguing the opposite, and still others suggesting that women's status over the centuries might have seen more continuity than transformation. Yes, she, a leading feminist medievalist scholar, is talking about women's status, both about change from the year 1100 to 1500, but also from the year 1100 through 1500 to now. First, she describes the change for the better model of how we understand the past. She says change for the better is perhaps the most common interpretation, as many of us have, embraced almost automatically by many students and modern historians, buttressed by popular myths about chastity belts and droit de seigneur. What? Myths? Yes, that's right. All you would have needed to do is Google or Wikipedia chastity belts, or droit de seigneur, also known as the prima noctis or prima nocta night, a supposed legal right in medieval Europe. Total myth. References to it are all from later periods than the medieval period. Chastity belts, while there are chastity belts made, 16th to 17th century, such belts were historically designed by men for women, ostensibly for the purpose of chastity, but according to modern myths, the chastity belt was used during the Crusades. However, research into the history of the chastity belt, again, this is just Wikipedia, suggests that they were not used until the 16th century, then only rather rarely. They really first became widely available in the form of 19th century anti-masturbation medical devices. Anti-masturbation, not about chastity. And so, buttressed by popular myths about chastity belts and droit de seigneur, this notion of the Middle Ages as an oppressive time for women neatly complements Whiggish histories of ever improving human circumstances. Here she is, in a lot of ways, very adjacent to Foucault. If one assumes that medieval England was necessarily a less developed civilization than industrial England, medieval women must have been oppressed in egregious ways. Most medievalists reject these assumptions. But some have traced change for the better within the Middle Ages itself, and she goes on about that. Yes, my friends, chastity belts and the rights of droit de seigneur prima noctis were ideas invented after the Middle Ages, then attached retroactively by those early moderns, or moderns who, you guessed it, benefit from painting the past as more repressive than it was. Popular assumptions that medieval women were generally subject to such absurdities, paired with the doxic assumption in our culture that rights are always equitable to freedoms, are generally manifestations of the repressive hypothesis. Bennett here does acknowledge a scholarly line of argument, as we said, that women's freedoms generally improved from 1100 to 1500, largely because the empowerment of working class laborers meant empowerment for women workers too. But she says the baseline assumption that women were generally better off in periods following 1500 is, again, rejected by most medievalists. Remember, if we are evaluating history in terms of centuries here, then we have to compare the 15th century to, say, like 1920 through 2020, taken in full. Think about what you know about women's freedoms during the last 100 years of history. As for change for the worse, that model cuts powerfully and productively against the repressive hypothesis. Change for the worse would say that women's rights have gotten worse from 1100 through 1500 to today, or at least women's freedoms. In my opinion, this is a bit idealistic. Ever since, she writes, in 1926, Eileen Power argued for the rough and ready equality of medieval women. Some medievalists have evoked ideas of a medieval golden age for women, and its necessarily analog a decline of women's status with the advent of modernity. Although no medievalist would argue that women's lives were glorious in the Middle Ages, many do assert that medieval women were nevertheless less subordinated to men than women have been since. But I would say here, to resist the repressive hypothesis, and this is important, to resist the repressive hypothesis is not to say things were less repressed in the past than they are now. To resist it is mainly to face the reality of how oppressed things still are, and how much of that oppression is built on exaggerations of the past. Think about it. Women should be happy with the modern life they have from 1920 to 2020, because at least they don't have to deal with chastity belts and droit de seigneur, by which apparently a lord could just say he wants to sleep with any woman, and he just gets to. This is not real, right? So to face the reality of how oppressed these things still are, and how much of that oppression is built on exaggerations of the past, and thus in so doing to sharpen our understanding of the past and present. So how about what I would subscribe to in relation to this and other subjects, the change without transformation, the continuities over transformation model. This is one of my favorite little bits of medieval cultural history. So I'll read this to you in full. Yet a third interpretation stresses change without transformation. I'm right here, arguing that the change traced by such scholars as Baron Goldberg, McNamara, Stewart, and Stenton altered the specific experiences of women, without transforming their overall status vis-a-vis men. Hence, for example, female wage workers in the late 14th century England earned higher wages than before the Black Death, a change in experience. But they were still paid about 70% of the wages paid to men, which is a continuity in status. Did you get that moment of brilliant shade? In the Middle Ages, women in the just after the Black Death were still oppressed because they were only paid 70% of the wages paid to men. I'm sorry to break it to you, but in 2020, women in the United States at least earn 81 cents for every dollar men make. In 2020, by the way, black women earn 61 cents for every dollar that their white male counterparts are paid. And so between 61 and 81 cents to the dollar is actually not that different, as Bennett points out here, than what medieval women were making in relation to what medieval men were making. Studies of working women, she goes on, in the later Middle Ages have traced considerable change in the specifics of women's work. Women left some occupations and took up others. Their wages rose slightly in some decades and fell in others. They worked more in the home at some times than others. Yet these studies have also traced impressive continuities in the basic structures of women's work. In 1300, 1500, and 1700, women's work varied in time-specific ways, but compared to men's work, women's work remained characteristically low-skilled, low-status, and poorly remunerated, as it still is today. Again, neither I nor Bennett is trying to say, see, women weren't really repressed back then. I'm trying to point out scholars' observations that women's repression is more of a historical constant than we are willing to admit, so that we are made better able to read medieval texts because we've stopped using them as effigy-style placeholders or throwing them under the bus to facilitate our own denial of the suppressions of the present. If we're adding our whole most recent century to the mix, which is only fair, from 1920 to 2020, then we're really in trouble. Let's dwell on the roaring 20s and 30s for a second, playfully, right? The supposed roaring 20s, these times of freedom, because they offer us some useful examples for understanding and transcending the repressive hypothesis.
This is from Cole Porter's 1934 song, Anything Goes. Right? This is a classic example of the kind of repressive hypothesis that Foucault is critiquing. In olden days, a glimpse of stocking was looked on as something shocking. But now, God knows, anything goes. Foucault is pushing back on that kind of repressive hypothesis. Right? He's saying, I'm sorry, what evidence do you have that what evidence do you have other than the top-down and often practically unenforceable laws and policies and religious tracts that history books focus on to the exclusion of everyday practice? What evidence do you have other than the report of your grandma, who is lovely, but whose reliability as you well know, compromised by, number one, a culture of nostalgia, and number two, a tendency for grandparents not to reveal sexual details to their grandkids regarding their youth? Other than that, what evidence do you have that all people in the olden days actually looked at a glimpse of stocking as something shocking? And really, to what olden days are you referring? And why are you so sure that right now is where those olden days have ended? And have you really understood that by assuring us all that now we are impossibly lucky to be born at just the right moment when repression has been finally lifted, you are positioning us rhetorically, maybe strategically so, in the place where we are most likely to accept without question any repressions that are laid on us because we're better off now than before? Foucault argues essentially that present repressions usually rely on a misreading of the past as more repressive than it actually was. I'll say that again. Present repression usually relies on a misreading of the past as more repressive than it actually was. Here is a page from the edition of Mankind that Cole Porter, if the 1920s dramatist decided to look at what the olden days really looked at in terms of performance and shock value, this is what he would have been able to find. This is a major anthology of pre-Shakespearean drama published in 1924, so it would have been, pretty current, and it includes Mankind. It's not as easy to read or as heavily glossed as your edition is. So you can see here, though, that Adams, the editor, notates with long ellipses when there's been an area damaged or lost in the manuscript. You remember from your team's edition that it does the same for the lost bit that includes this entrance of new guys nowadays and not. We suddenly find them on stage. There seems to be something missing in the macro manuscript here. Right? And you see the rest of the dialogue that you recognize pretty closely. Or here. Now here are more ellipses that Adams provides. After nowadays' line here, and nots here. Right? Do you remember these lines being lost in your edition? Trick question. They weren't lost. In your edition, and read along with Adams's version, in your edition, nowadays says, I pray you heartily, worshipful clerk, to have this English mad in Latin. Right? So we've left out a line there, possibly just as an error. Nowadays is saying, I pray you heartily, worshipful priest, to translate the English I'm about to speak to you into Latin. I have eaten a dish full of curds, and I have shitten your mouth full of turds. Adams leaves that out. Next, Naught says, Lo, master, here is a pardon, belly met, whatever that means. It is granted of Pope Pocket, if you will put your nose in his wife's socket, you shall have 40 days of pardon. Adams gives a little footnote here in his edition. This is the 1924 edition. Omitted because of obscenity. It's easy to miss. And the passive construction omitted because of kind of suggests that it could as easily be Adams or Adams's source manuscript that does the omitting here, right? It's been omitted because of obscenity. Now notice Adams has no problem including the bits about making fun of Catholic clerics and the Pope, suggesting that the Pope is married and would have you put your nose in his wife's socket. Even during the 1920s, when we know Catholics, being post-doxic, were quite angry at being disrespected by the English, enough that they blew up the Four Courts building in Dublin, destroying, among other things, the remaining manuscript of The Pride of Life. But turds in your mouth and a nose in a wife's socket? That's not readable. Well, I guess in Cole Porter's time, not everything goes. But in the medieval period, it did. This is in the text that comes down to us from the 15th century. We see here evidence of bodies and their desires being thus increasingly repressed over time, even as the later, more repressed time characterizes itself popularly as being unusually, roaringly liberated, the 1920s and early 30s, when anything goes. Here's the passage you're about to read, as Adams presents it in his edition. Will you read along with me, please? In the left column, enter New Guise. New Guise says, "The weather is cold. God send us good fires." And then there's the Latin, which means the holy are with the holy, or will be with the holy, and the perverse with the perverse, but which Adams uses a quote from Psalms to translate as, "With the pure thou wilt show thyself pure, and with the froward thou wilt show thyself froward." And the New Guise makes an elusive Latin reference, as though the devil is quoting scripture to the friars. "Behold how good and pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. Ecce quam bonum et quam jucundum habitare fratres in unum." And then Mankind says, "I hear a fellow speak, with him I will not mell. This earth with my spade I shall essay to delve." Notice interestingly here, Adams is more hands-off with spelling adaptation. He leaves the spelling of should or shall as Xall. Right, the medieval East Anglian pronunciation, which your edition modernizes to Shall. He continues, "To eschew idleness, I do it mine own self. I pray God send it his fruition," as Adams glosses it. Mankind, he gives a stage direction. He begins to dig. That's a fair deduction. Enter nowadays and not shouting to the audience. Now, this is another mid-play attention grabber, by the way, where they yell, "Make room, sirs, we have been long." But notice the anachronistically theatrical framework of this enter, as we've said before, which leads Adams to say in his footnote right here at footnote 6, apparently the actors have to pass through the audience to reach their platform. Okay. "Make room, sirs, for we have been away long. We will come give you a Christmas song." Naught says, "Now I pray all the yeomanry that is here to sing with us with a merry cheer." And Adams deduces reasonably that Naught then sings a line at a time, which New Guise and Nowadays, leading the audience, sing after him, right? So they're leading the audience because they said all the yeomanry that are here sing with us. That's fair. And here is the song that they sing. "It is written with a coal. It is written with a coal." And then Nowadays and New Guise respond here at the top of the second column. "It is written with a coal. It is written with a coal." Notice now that with a coal is in brackets, suggesting that there's editorial action happening. And then we have an ellipsis. And then the manuscript stage direction, "Cantant omnes," that's in the manuscript, just translated rightly as all sing. Then New Guise, and there's another line, "Holy, holy, 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 holy," that sort of nonsense line, holik. And the New Guise says, "Eh, mankind, God speed you with your spade. I shall tell you of a marriage. I would," then another ellipsis, "then were married jointly together." So, Picture yourself as Cole Porter writing the song Anything Goes. In the 1920s and early 30s, Cole Porter, were he to read this, might reasonably conclude, "Oh, I see they had musical theater back then. They're singing a song, but I really can't follow it much," this is my 1920s voice, "with all the Latin and the missing pieces." The footnotes for these two ellipses, you see, say, "The song is unprintable," and then again, "unprintable." You see what Adams does here? What, to someone who's coming to this text for the first time, does unprintable mean? The addition seems to sort of be somewhere between the deletion of the shit lines from before, which we have no way of viewing if they've been cut, which are omitted because of obscenity, though omitted by whom, Adams doesn't say, and the damage to the manuscript at New Guys and Nowadays and Naught's entrance, which is just damaged, and so the same, and it's the same notation, right? Long ellipses. What does unprintable mean? What would you think coming across this text in the Roaring Twenties? What is in this space, do you think? I will introduce you to it through the most recent PLS reading of what the extant manuscript actually says. We set the song to a 15th century English tune. We were trying to be as accurate as possible in that regard. So we had to cut a few of the words ourselves, but we kept most of the words from the manuscript. Here's the clip.
Holly, 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 ho. Holly, 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 ho. It is written with a coal. It is written with a coal. He that sheddeth, sheddeth with his whole. He that sheddeth, sheddeth with his whole. Unless he wipes his arse clean, on his breeches shall they sing. Holy, 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 holy.
No, the yeomanry here, that's you, shall sing with us with a merry cheer. First us.
Holy, 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 holy. Let me hear you.
Holy, 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 holy.
It is written with a coal. It is written with a coal. He that shitteth, shitteth with his whole. He that shitteth, shitteth with his soul. Unless he wipes his arse clean, wipes his arse clean. Unless he wipes his arse clean, wipes his arse clean. On his breeches shall he sing. On his breeches shall he sing. Thank you. Thank you. That was for you. That was for you.
And we got a few complaints from parents there, by the way, who said the production was enjoyable, but there were parts not appropriate for children. And they were right. The shit song is not appropriate for children by present-day standards, as you must surely have realized. As you will remember by now, we have every reason to believe that kids, adults, whoever would have been around for Mankind and the Shit Song in the 1460s, if only because no social rules were in place to keep them out. Because you probably said, when I showed you the 1920s version, well, that was then in the 1920s. But we're liberated now. It's the 2020s. And we would have no problem looking at the shit song now. And then you probably added in the back of your head, I mean, as long as you didn't do that shit song in a place where kids could see. You know, like nearly every public place. Then you'd be fine. We also had complaints similarly at the cloisters when we did it there. I'll tell you more about that later. What was it Lee Edelman said about how present-day culture exerts its repressions primarily through the imagining of harm to children? Oh, right. He says, the lives, the speech, and the freedoms of adults face constant threat of legal curtailment out of deference to imaginary children, whose futures are construed as endangered. What is the harm about talking about shit in front of a child? I'm sure you may take it for granted that it's just not something you say in front of a child. The word shit, nor any word for defecation, does not seem to have registered as improper or rude before 1500. Attached to that fact is the plain implication that medieval culture did not have the doxic assumption that talk about feces should be something very, very strictly repressed, except in certain spaces and contexts. Shit, it was within my own lifetime that I can remember when it delicately started being okay to even refer directly to human defecation in mainstream TV shows. Oh, but that was in the 80s and 90s. But now in the 2020s, we are free and liberated. I want to draw your attention to a book that kids often read in the present day. This is Tarugomi's 2001 Everyone Poops.
Which wasn't entirely well received in its time. I'm going to quote some reviewers here. To quote one reviewer, call it what you will, by euphemism or by expletive, poop by any name seems an unsuitable picture book subject. But the popularity of this book lies in its ability to help, and quoting other reviews here, quote, young people accept their bodily functions. To help kids, quote, needing reassurance that their most mysterious bodily function is as natural as can be, or another quote, to take the shame away from pooping. It's hardly novel to point out that a culture of poop shame is directly and obviously correlatable to high rates of irritable bowel syndrome and inflammatory bowel disease. But it is perhaps novel, and by the way, that effect is disproportionately shown on women, particularly women in the workplace. But it is perhaps novel to think of the systemic modern shaming of shitting as a form of culturally systemic repression of bodies in the English-speaking world, akin to sex shaming, to the degree where certain English words relating to defecation, like shit, are shielded from view with more vigor than the actual depiction of violence, even from children's view. But ask perhaps, why doesn't shit shaming even register in conversations about the repression of bodily functions and desires by shame? What cultural assumptions have rendered it unspeakable, even in those conversations? The upshot here is that in present-day society, particularly separate from agricultural experiences, kids literally need to be reminded with a children's book that everyone poops, and that that's okay. That doesn't speak well of our cultural moment, especially in comparison to mankind's.
Did anyone clock New Guys in the shit song scene, by the way? New Guys, an allegory for the moral decadence of the present day, well, the 1464 present day, the way that those fashionable teenagers are acting. He comes toward mankind first to distract him by suggesting that, hell, even the Bible says that the perverse ought to hang around the perverse. And in a charmingly anti-clerical turn, you should know what that means by now, he imagines the devil talking to friars, that is, members of the monastic parts of the clergy, who lived in all-male spaces, and who were indeed in later medieval English discourse often satirized in the anti-clerical tradition for breaking their vows of celibacy with nuns, or with women, or with each other. And the devil says how good and pleasurable it is for brethren to live together. And then after the song, in the next bit that Adams censored, New Guy says, I shall tell you of a marriage. I wish that your mouth and his arse that this made were married jointly together. I wish that your mouth and his ass that made this were joined together in marriage. His ass that made what? That made the song? That made the stain on the breeches? Was that visible in performance? In front of kids? And also, notice he is inviting mankind not only to kiss his ass, but to join his mouth with a man's ass, as though in marriage. I mean, I feel like that, alongside New Guys' frequent references to his own junk throughout the play, at least warrants a footnote. But there isn't any in your team's edition. And that's not surprising, because here is the 2008 edition of the Cambridge Companion to Medieval Theatre, reviewing a live production of Mankind that had been done years before. Not mine, by the way. Quote, inappropriate modernization has appeared in some recent productions of Mankind. A Stanislavskian Mankind seems simply misguided, but a gay Mankind, in which mercy derives pleasure from being abused by the vices, or a post-Christian one, in which he is merely a tedious rehearser of platitudes, are something worse than that. They define any possible concept the medieval playwright could have had, and thereby produce not reinterpretation, but misappropriation. Take note here. And this is about as mainstream as medieval drama studies gets, the Cambridge Companion. The very idea of being gay or perhaps of being gay and into kink, is a modernization worse than inappropriate. It defies any possible concept a medieval person could have had, assumedly because kink and/or gay sex are modern inventions, because in our time anything goes, but back then. Notice, too, that McKinnell also finds any reading of Mercy as purposefully tedious in a way that audience members might take delight in his being disrupted and interrupted, is only conceivable in modernity. Notice the conceptual apparatus for both repressive hypotheses, the repression of the possibility of homosexuality and the repression of the possibility of questioning faith, is the same, and that they frame the medieval text in a particular way. But that was in 2008. But now, in 2020, we are fully unrepressed. I just received my ballot to vote in the 2020 election back home, by the way. So you might say, well, that's only what some academic writing said in 2008, but in everyday practice, everyone was open in 2008 to the idea of queerness. And I might say, everyone? And I might remind you how small a percentage of evidence survives from everyday practice and performance from the late 1400s. And I might remind you to ask who it was usually that did the copying down and writing of those texts, including the modification of those texts and the decision whether to preserve them. And I might ask you how representative of everyday life those clerical scribes might have been. I want to read these plays through many eyes, and I want those eyes to be as clear as possible from anachronistic assumptions, because that is my only hope for learning something from the past that isn't just a weak and strategic reflection of the present. Now, with all that in mind, I have an assignment for you. You should now finish reading Mankind. And do finish it. If it goes past the allotted time to read it, then start taking time away from the Castle of Perseverance. And as you read, each of you is responsible for finding, for one word or line in Mankind, and just one word or line, any one, a modernization that you feel you can critique or analyze productively. Something where you can say, the modern reader has missed something crucial in the original. And there are tons of ways you might do this. You can identify a stage direction or footnote or editorial gloss. We call glosses the rough translations on the right side of your Teams edition. And you can use then the Middle English Dictionary or other resources to show what the Teams edition's interpretation has left out. Or you can choose a favorite scene in the Teams edition and then scan through the video of our 2016 Toronto production on YouTube, I'll link you to that, to find it. And then critique one of the ways we presented our modernization in translation or staging, saying there's something we missed. Or if you're really hardcore, you can choose a favorite scene in the Teams edition, then scan through the manuscript at luna.folger.edu to find something that doesn't line up perfectly there. All I want you to be able to do is be ready to say on Monday, briefly, in a way you can express under a minute. Time yourself. It's not hard. The discrepancy you found and how it might affect a reader's understanding. I found X at line Y. I think it means Z. So you might say, and let's time it. I found X that the editors added mischief enters at line 44, immediately before mischief starts speaking in the opening scene. I think it means that readers might unnecessarily rule out the likelihood that mischief has been watching from among the spectators the whole time, which seems likely, and that mutes the possibility that he might be one of many hecklers in the audience and that some spectators might not have thus taken Mercy's speech much more seriously than Mercy did. So having mischief enter so late reduces the ability that we have to interpret Mercy's speech as something that can be questioned, heckled, or made fun of. 39 seconds. Easy as that. So be ready to do that on Zoom on Monday. I'll call on you randomly, so you might not get to share yours. If you've opted for an alternative avenue for participation with me, just share your contribution in whatever way for participation you and I have agreed upon. And if you haven't taken advantage of an alternative avenue for participation, but you find the idea of my calling on you at random to share something you prepared ahead of time intimidating in a way that keeps you from learning, then it seems like now is the time for you to activate one of the alternative avenues for participation. See the online syllabus for more. Okay, from here, go finish Mankind.